He picked up a bride running, barefoot in a torn dress. She was escaping a millionaire, wedding she never wanted. The rain was merciless that night, falling in torrents thick enough to blur the world. Trees swayed like shadowy giants on either side of the narrow country road. Jake's old pickup truck rumbled forward, its windshield wipers fighting desperately against the sheets of water. The headlights sliced through the darkness, barely reaching 10 feet ahead. But this road, winding, cracked, half-forgotten, was familiar. It had always taken him home. He tapped the steering wheel in rhythm with an old jazz song, humming faintly from the dusty dashboard radio. He was covered in grease, his boots soaked from a late-night emergency brake job at the garage. Jake didn't usually stay this late, but tonight he had needed the quiet, the rhythm of tools, the comfort of an engine's hum. Since his mother passed, these small rituals were what anchored him. And then, just as he rounded a bend near the old miller's cornfield, his foot froze on the pedal. A figure stood at the edge of the road. Jake blinked hard, leaning forward, his heart kicking once, then again. It was a woman. No umbrella, no coat, just a long, white dress soaked and clinging to her body torn at the hem. She was barefoot, her hair blonde and wild plastered to her face. She was hugging herself, her arms wrapped tight like she was trying to keep her soul from slipping out. He slammed the brakes. The tires screeched and the truck slid a few feet before jerking to a halt on the wet gravel. Jake stared at her through the rain-blurred windshield. The world had narrowed to this one moment, surreal and silent but for the pounding of the rain on his roof. She didn't move, just stood there, blinking through the storm. And suddenly he was transported, back to a night almost 20 years ago. His mom, bloodied and dazed, stuck in her overturned car on a road not far from this one. It was a stranger in an old truck, who had pulled over, who stayed with her, who made sure she got to a hospital. That man had vanished before they could even say thank you. But Jake never forgot. That act of kindness had lived in him ever since, quietly shaping the man he became. He reached over and grabbed his weathered work jacket off the passenger seat, then opened the door and stepped out into the downpour. Rain smacked his face instantly, cold and blinding. He held up his hands as he walked slowly toward her. "Hey," he called, his voice raised but gentle. "I'm not here to scare you, okay?" She didn't flinch, but she didn't respond either. He stopped a few feet away, keeping his distance, and held out the jacket. "At least stay dry while you decide," he said. She looked at him for the first time, really looked. Her eyes were red-rimmed, mascara streaking down her cheeks. There was fear there, but not just fear. There was exhaustion, desperation, like someone who had been running from something for a long, long time. Still, she didn't speak. Jake stayed where he was, letting the rain soak through his shirt. The jacket held steady in the air between them. After what felt like an eternity, she stepped forward carefully, like someone approaching a cliff's edge. She took the jacket in both hands and wrapped it around her trembling frame. Then she looked toward the truck. "I'm Jake," he said quietly. "You don't have to tell me your name. You don't have to explain anything. I'm not leaving you out here." She said nothing but nodded once, barely, and walked to the truck, opening the door and climbing inside. Jake exhaled, not realizing he'd been holding his breath. He followed her, shut the door behind them, and turned the key in the ignition. The heater sputtered to life, blowing warm air across the cabin. Steam rose from their soaked clothes, the windows fogging up quickly. She pulled the jacket tighter around her shoulders, staring straight ahead. Her dress clung to her knees, torn and stained with mud. Jake didn't ask anything. He knew that look. He'd seen it in his own mirror after the funeral, after his world had cracked in two. "A safe place is about 10 minutes down the road," he said, his voice low and steady. "If you want, I can take you there." Still no answer, just silence. He adjusted the heat, turned off the radio, and started driving. They rode in quiet for several minutes. The sound of the rain and the hum of the engine were the only things between them. Finally, as the lights of the small town came into view, she spoke just one word. Claire. Jake didn't react much, just nodded slightly. I'm glad you told me, he said. It's a good name. He didn't respond again. But she didn't pull away either, when he gently passed her a dry towel from under the seat. By the time they pulled into the back lot behind Jake's garage, the rain had eased. The storm was passing, but something else had just begun. Neither of them knew it yet. But that night, between the rain and the silence, a new story had started. It was one not written in fairy tales, but steamed jackets, broken roads, and the quiet kindness of a stranger who remembered what it felt like to be saved. The rain had slowed to a drizzle by the time Jake turned into the gravel lot behind his garage. The faded sign above the door read, Weller's Auto, dimly lit by a flickering security light. The building was nothing fancy, just old brick, but it was cared for. Jake parked near the back door and shut off the engine. Claire sat in silence. The jacket he had given her remained wrapped tightly around her. The tension between them had shifted. It was no longer just fear, but something tentative, uncertain, like a trust not yet spoken. Jake cleared his throat. There's an old office in the back of the shop. It's not much, but there's a couch and a space heater. You can stay there for the night. Claire turned toward him slowly, her expression guarded. I can take you to a hotel in the morning, Jake added quickly, but the nearest one is 20 miles out and nothing's open this late. She hesitated, then said softly, just for tonight. Jake nodded. Just for tonight. He grabbed a key from the visor and stepped out into the damp night air. When he opened her door, Claire stepped out slowly, her soaked dress clinging to her legs, her breath rising in faint clouds. Inside, the garage smelled of oil, rubber, and something strangely comforting like old coffee and warm dust. The office space was small, cluttered with parts catalogs. An old filing cabinet, a beat-up couch covered by a faded quilt, and a buzzing space heater in the corner. Jake flicked on a small lamp and a soft light warmed the room. You can stay here, he said. I've got some clean flannel and sweats from the shop's emergency stash. He placed them gently on the arm of the sofa. Claire nodded, her arms still folded tightly across her chest. Jake handed her a blanket and a pillow. Then he met her gaze, his voice steady. I'll be outside in the truck. Lock the door. You'll be safe. She blinked, surprised. You don't have to do that. I do, he interrupted, quietly. You don't know me, and I don't want you to feel like you owe me anything. He hesitated for a moment. If the heater acts up, just knock on the window. Then he stepped out and gently closed the door behind him. Claire locked it, standing alone for a moment in the warm, humming room. She exhaled, then slowly peeled off her wet dress, draped it over a chair, and changed into the oversized clothes. The warmth clung to her, and it made her eyes sting with unshed tears. She curled onto the sofa, the blanket wrapped tightly around her. The hum of the heater filled the small space. Sleep did not come. She stared at the ceiling, her fingers curled into the old quilt. Then in the dark she whispered, I was supposed to marry Edward. The name hovered in the air like fog. He's from my parents' world. It was all arranged. Not officially, of course, but it felt like a contract. She swallowed hard. My dad said it would secure our legacy. My mom called it the dream wedding. I called it a prison. She paused, then added, the planner told me what lipstick to wear. Her voice cracked. I wasn't even invited to my own life. Outside in the truck, Jake sat, still, eyes open now, listening. Not because he was being nosy, but because the silence between her words felt like something sacred. I ran, Claire said, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't even think. I just got in the first car I saw. The driver let me off miles from here. I've been walking ever since. She curled deeper under the blanket. I know I look insane, but it was mine. It was my choice. There was a long pause. Then, through the faint hum of the heater, she heard it. Jake's voice, soft, coming through the window. You don't sound crazy. Claire sat up, startled. You sound like someone who finally started breathing. She stared at the window. No more words followed, just the faint creak of him shifting in the truck seat. She lay back down slowly, her heart fluttering. This wasn't home. But for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like a cage either. Wrapped in borrowed flannel beside a humming heater in a garage far from everything she once knew, Claire let her body relax. And for the first time in weeks, she slept. Claire never meant to stay more than one night. But when morning came, gray, damp, and quiet, she stayed. The scent of oil, flannel, and something that felt like safety lingered in the air. A note waited on the old filing cabinet. Coffee's on the counter. I'll be outside if you need anything. Jake. She checked the door. It was still locked, just as she'd left it. By the third day, the storm outside had passed, but something quieter inside her remained unsettled. The garage wasn't her world. It was cluttered, dusty, and honest. Coffee came in mismatched mugs. There were no gilded mirrors, no marble countertops, just tools, grease, and the constant, comforting hum of work. Jake didn't say much, but his silence spoke volumes. A dry towel left near the small shop shower, a cup of tea placed on the desk, the heater shifted closer on a windy night. His care was quiet, but it was real. She tried to be useful. When Jake struggled with a heavy tire rack, she stepped in to help. You don't have to, he began. I want to, she said firmly. She started helping around the shop, labeling oil filters, handing him tools, and wiping down shelves. She ruined a manicure she no longer missed. Gradually, she stopped flinching at the sight of grease. She stopped checking her reflection in every shiny surface. She started asking how the tools worked. She listened. One evening, she found Jake hunched over something small on the workbench. It wasn't a car part, but a beautiful old pocket watch. It was my mom's, he explained, not looking up. I've been meaning to fix it for years. She asked to see it. He handed it over. It was old and scratched, but the craftsmanship was familiar. She smiled faintly. I used to open my dad's watches when I was little. He hated it. He said girls shouldn't touch gears. Jake smirked. Bet he regrets that now. They opened the watch together, their heads close, their breaths fogging in the cool evening air. Jake passed her a tiny screwdriver. You've got steadier hands. As she worked, he murmured, every tick is a second you've never lived before. A chance to start something new. She looked up at him. That's surprisingly poetic for a mechanic. He shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. Maybe machines and people aren't so different. Both just need a little care to get working right again. She laughed, a genuine, unburdened sound. It was the first time in a long while. Later that night, lying on the sofa, she watched the now working watch tick softly beside her. Something had shifted. Not just in the tiny gears, but in her. By the end of the week, she didn't feel like a guest anymore. She knew where Jake hid the good coffee mugs. She recognized the sound of Earl's sputtering truck when it pulled in. She walked to the local market, alone, and returned to polite nods from the townspeople. She was becoming someone again, someone new. Jake stayed quiet, never asking what came next, but sometimes she would catch him watching her with a gentle, unreadable expression. One morning, their fingers brushed as they both reached for the same wrench. It was just for a second, but something electric passed between them. They both paused, eyes locked, breath held. She pulled her hand away first. He said nothing. But that night she couldn't sleep. She didn't know what the future held. But in that garage with Jake's quiet kindness and the watch ticking steadily beside her, she wasn't lost. She was just beginning. The town was small, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and where a stranger stood out like a bent nail on a smooth board. At first, Claire felt every glance, every quiet stare. But it turned out that people here didn't stare out of judgment. They stared out of curiosity and maybe even a little bit of care. Jake had been right. The town was no place for glitz and glamour, but it was a place for something much deeper. It was at the diner 2 blocks down that Claire first met Mary. Mary was the kind of woman who greeted you with a sharp tongue and warm eyes. She had a thick Irish accent, hair like a pile of snow on top of her head, in an apron that always bore a dusting of flour from some half-finished pie. She had known Jake since he was just a boy with knees too big for his jeans, as she put it. When Claire walked in behind him one morning, Mary narrowed her eyes and said, "So you're the one they're all whispering about." "Runaway bride, eh?" Claire froze. Jake opened his mouth to intervene, but Mary raised a hand. "Relax, darling. I was a runaway myself once. Only I ran from Dublin with a worn-out suitcase and a half-empty whiskey bottle." "You've got more class," Claire smiled, her shoulders visibly easing. From that day on, Mary took Claire under her wing. She didn't ask too many questions or prod into her past. Instead, she handed her an apron and said, "If you're going to hang around Jake's place, you'd better learn how to bake something that doesn't come out of a box." Claire, surprisingly, loved it. She cracked eggs, sifted flour, and learned the gentle grounding rhythm of kneading dough. It was something hers. For the first time in years, her hands were making, not just presenting. One afternoon, as she pulled a tray of perfect cinnamon rolls from the oven, Mary leaned in with a wink. "Wink. You've got the touch, girl. Maybe even better than mine. But don't you dare tell the priest I said that." Across town, Claire met Tom. Tom was a proud Mexican-American who owned a landscaping business and brought his beat-up van to Jake every month like clockwork. He had a wide laugh and an even, louder voice. When Claire handed him his keys one afternoon, her hands smudged with grease from helping Jake with the brake pads, Tom let out a mock gasp. "Wait a minute, La Princesa gets her hands dirty?" Jake smirked from nearby. Claire grinned back. "She does now." Tom chuckled and added with a wink, "Well, if you ever get tired of fixing cars, you should know those cinnamon rolls you're making at Mary's ought to be illegal. They're too good." Jake shot her a playful glance. "Better than my brake jobs?" Tom gave a dramatic shrug. "Let's just say if you two ever open a business together, I'm investing in hers." The laughter echoed off the garage walls. In moments like those, Claire forgot the heavy weight of her last name, forgot Edward, the polished invitations, the crystal goblets. She was starting to belong. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, painting the sky in hues of peach and plum, Claire sat with Jake on the tailgate of his truck. A small speaker between them played old jazz, brassy, worn, and familiar. Jake looked out over the quiet parking lot. "My mom loved this stuff. Used to dance around the kitchen to Ella and Miles." Claire sipped her tea, the steam curling like smoke in the crisp air. "My parents hated music. Said it was a distraction from our expectations." Jake glanced over at her. "That sounds exhausting." "It was," she said, softly. They sat in comfortable silence for a while before she asked, "Do you ever think about what's next? What you really want?" Jake leaned back, resting on his elbows. "Yeah, sometimes. I dream about opening a sort of garage school. Teach kids who've got nowhere else to go, kids like I was. Give them a set of tools, not just a bunch of lectures." Claire smiled. "That's beautiful, Jake." He glanced at her. "What about you?" She hesitated, then a real honest answer came to her. I'd open a little pastry counter. Nothing fancy. Just good coffee, warm rolls, and a place where no one has to pretend to be anything they're not. Jake's eyes lingered on her for a beat, longer than usual. Sounds like a place worth going to, he said, his voice soft. Their eyes met, quiet and real. Shared heartbeat in the soft light. No one leaned in. No lips touched. But the air between them shifted, charged with something fragile and new. Claire looked away first, her cheeks warm. Jake cleared his throat and stood. But tomorrow, Earl's bringing in that busted-up Impala. Want to help me with the carburetor? She smiled. Only if you promise to try my new chocolate croissants, Jake smirked. Deal. They walked back toward the garage under the fading light. Two people, not rushing anything, not labeling anything, just moving, steadily closer together. The piece unraveled exactly 7 ton. Days after Claire began to feel like she might actually stay. It started at Max's bar, where Earl, after one too many beers, spoke a little too freely to a stranger in a suit who turned out to be a private investigator. The next morning, Jake was under the hood of a rusted-out truck when a sleek black SUV pulled into the gravel lot. 3 men stepped out, one in a sharp navy suit, one carrying a briefcase, and the third was Edward. Jake wiped his greasy hands on a rag and walked forward. Can I help you? Edward's voice was smooth as a polished marble. I'm here for Claire Whitmore. Jake didn't budge. Why? I'm her fiancé. She's not well. Behind them, the office door creaked open. Claire stepped out, her face pale, but her posture steady. Edward forced a tight smile. Claire, darling, thank God. The man with the briefcase added, your parents have authorized us to escort you back. There will be no legal action yet, but we are prepared to make statements to the media. Jake moved subtly, placing himself between them and Claire. Claire's voice was firm, surprising, even herself. I'm not going with you. Edward's smile slipped. Claire, be reasonable. This man has clearly taken advantage of you during a breakdown. I haven't broken down, she said, her voice gaining strength. I've woken up. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She answered it. Claire, her mother's voice snapped through the phone. You're embarrassing us. You are destroying everything we've built. No, Claire said quietly, but firmly. I'm choosing to live. She ended the call. Edward took a step forward. You're giving up everything for what? Baking pies in a garage? Claire's voice shook, but she stood her ground. Yes. Because here I'm not drowning. Edward narrowed his eyes. If you don't come back, your father will press charges. The tabloids will have a field day with this greasy mechanic. Don't care. Jake spoke then, his voice calm but layered with steel. That's enough. Before it could escalate further, a town police cruiser pulled in. Sheriff Hank stepped out. Jake nodded at him. Hey, Hank. Mind helping me out here? Hank turned to Claire. Ma'am, are you here by your own choice? Claire looked Edward dead in the eye. I am. Hank nodded. Then there's no reason for anyone to remove you. This is private property. I'd suggest you all leave. Edward's face darkened. This isn't over. Claire stepped forward. It is for me. The SUV pulled away, kicking up gravel. Claire sank onto the steps, her legs suddenly weak. Jake sat beside her. You okay? She nodded faintly. I didn't think they'd actually come here. You don't have to run again, he said, gently. I'll stand with you, she looked at him, her eyes glossy with tears. And risk your business? Your life? We'll figure it out, he said. But that night Jake found a note on his desk. Jake, thank you for giving me back pieces of myself I thought I'd lost. You weren't just a safe place, you were more. That's why I can't let you be pulled into my mess. You once told me every tick of a clock is a second we haven't lived yet. I want you to live all of yours, without fear. I'll always carry you with me. Claire. Jake stood in the silent office. The ticking of the old watch on the workbench was suddenly the loudest thing in the world. Outside, the rain began to fall again. But this time she was gone. The shop was too quiet. Jake stared at the note in his hand, the ink slightly smudged from a tear, hers or maybe his thumb. The words blurred together, but the meaning was crystal clear. She was gone. Thank you for giving me back pieces of myself. I'm leaving so you won't suffer. Because of me. Jake dropped the paper, grabbed his keys, and ran. His boots pounded against the concrete floor as he jumped into his truck. The engine roared to life, gravel scattering behind him as he tore out of the lot and down the road. The clouds above threatened more rain, but his mind was already a storm. Don't be too late, he muttered to himself. Please, just don't be too late. He reached the bus depot on the edge of town. It was just a covered bench beside a faded billboard and a rusted sign that hadn't been changed in 10 years. A bus idled, its doors open, steam hissing from beneath the tires. And there she was. Claire stood near the steps, her bag in hand, her shoulders trembling. Her blonde hair was pulled into a loose knot, and the jacket she wore was the same one he had draped over her that very first rainy night. She looked over her shoulder once, then turned back toward the door. "Claire!" Jake shouted, his voice raw. She froze. He sprinted, his boots slapping against the wet pavement, his lungs burning. He reached her just as she was about to step up. "Claire!" he gasped, gently grabbing her hand. "If you leave now, I'll never forgive myself for not trying to stop you." She turned, her eyes wide, already glistening with unshed tears. "Jake! I have to. I don't care about Edward," he said, his voice urgent. "I don't care about lawsuits or newspapers or any of it. I care about you." Her own voice trembled. "I thought I was protecting you by running. You don't know what my family is capable of, what they could do to your life, to this town. I don't need protection from you," he said, his grip on her hand tightening slightly. "I need you. That's it. That's all." She stared at him, her throat bobbing as she tried to hold herself together. "I'm scared, Jake." "So am I," he whispered, his voice softening. "But I would rather be scared with you than be safe without you." Something inside her broke. The dam she had so carefully constructed finally gave way. Claire dropped her bag and threw her arms around his neck, sobbing into his chest. He wrapped her in his arms, holding her like she was something sacred, something he had almost lost forever. The bus driver watched quietly from the door, then gave a small nod to himself and closed it with a pneumatic hiss. The bus pulled away, leaving the couple locked in their own world. Jake leaned down, pressing his forehead against hers. "Come home, Claire." She nodded, tears still falling, but a small smile breaking through. Yes, I want to." They drove back in. Silence, but it was not the silence of distance. It was the silence of knowing, of a question finally answered. Her hand rested on the center console, and his hand came to rest over it. Neither of them let go. When they pulled back into the garage, the familiar sign buzzed faintly in the evening wind. The place hadn't changed, but everything inside them had. Jake helped her out of the truck and carried her bag inside, placing it gently beside the sofa that had become her sanctuary. He turned to her and paused. "This place, and it's not much, but it's yours now too. If you want it." Claire walked toward him, wrapped her arms around his waist, and leaned her head on his chest, breathing in the scent of oil and him. "It's the first place I ever felt like I could breathe." He held her close, his chin resting on the top of her head. That night they sat on the sofa, side by side, watching the old pocket watch on the wall. The one she had helped him fix. The second hand ticked softly, marking their new beginning. Jake glanced at her and said, quietly, "You told me every time a clock ticks, it's a second you. Haven't lived yet." Claire smiled, real gentle smile. "So let's live. This one. And the next one." They sat, together in the warmth of the small garage office as the rain started to fall again outside. But this time inside there was only peace. For the first time, this little room wasn't just a place to hide. It was home. The scent of cinnamon and fresh pastry now filled the air before dawn, long before the rest of the town began to stir. Claire, with a light dusting of flour across her apron and the bridge of her nose, rolled out dough in the small corner of Mary's cafe that had slowly transformed into her own. The sign above the counter now read Claire's Corner in beautiful, handwritten lettering that Mary had painted herself. It had taken time, 3 months of rising early, cleaning tables, taking orders, and learning the rhythm of a cafe that ran on local gossip, strong black coffee, and tradition. But Claire hadn't minded. With every morning she arrived, she felt less like a visitor and more like someone who truly belonged. Mary had pulled her aside one evening, wiping her hands on a towel, and said, "That little baking space by the window, it's yours now. No charge. Just keep feeding these old souls." She'd winked. "And maybe finally teach me how you get that pie crust. So flaky." Jake had helped too, of course, though never in ways that stole her credit. He repaired the cafe's old, grumbling refrigerator, installed a second oven that someone had donated and quietly fixed neighbors' cars in exchange for sacks of flour and cartons of fresh eggs. When Claire had protested, he only smiled. "Let me do this. For us." She had never heard someone say us before and mean it the way he did. Each pie, each cookie, each loaf of warm banana bread she sold was a small declaration that she could stand on her own 2 feet. And the town noticed. Customers started coming in not just for Mary's famous coffee, but for Claire's honey tarts and apple crumbles. Tom, who used to complain about everything, now came in twice a day. "Claire's pie saved my marriage," he joked one morning, earning a round of laughter from the regulars. "My wife thought I was having an affair with how much time I spend here. Even the local children would stop by after school, peeking through the glass for chocolate chip cookies and waving excitedly whenever Claire appeared in her apron." Life was simple, and for the first time, it was more than enough. Until one Friday afternoon, the sun was setting, casting a golden light over the storefront as Claire rang up her last customer. She looked up and froze. Edward was standing across the street, his hands in the pockets of his expensive trousers, sunglasses shielding his eyes. But even from that distance, she could see the tension in his jaw. He hadn't brought lawyers or thugs in suits. He had just brought himself. Claire stepped outside slowly, wiping her hands on her apron, her heart beat a dull roar in her ears. "I'm not here to take you back," Edward said, his voice calmer and more subdued than she had ever heard it. "I'm just here to understand why you left it all." Claire gestured to an empty table on the small patio. He followed her, and they sat. There was no pretense, no performance. "I couldn't breathe," she said quietly. "At home I felt like I was a puppet. Standing at that altar, I felt like I was watching someone else's life. And so I ran." He nodded slowly, his gaze distant. "I thought I was giving you everything you could ever want." "You gave me everything," Claire said, meeting his eyes. "But you never asked me who I was." For a long moment, Edward stared down at the table. Then he nodded again, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "I always thought love was about winning, about achieving, about owning. But maybe it's about letting go." Claire blinked, surprised by his honesty. Edward stood up. "I won't bother you again, Claire. But thank you for showing me what I couldn't see." He walked away, without another word. And that, Claire realized, was the real goodbye. The next morning the phone rang. just after sunrise. She almost didn't answer it, but something told her she should. Claire, it was her mother. There were no demands, no scolding, just her name, spoken softly and uncertainly. I just want to know if you're happy, she said, her voice fragile. Claire's throat tightened. I'm not rich, Mom. I'm not famous. But I get to choose my own mornings. Now. I get to make something beautiful with my own hands. And for the first time, Mom, I can breathe. There was a long silence on the other end, then a quiet, shaky breath. If you're okay, darling, then I'll learn how to be okay, too. Claire closed her eyes, letting the tears slip down her cheeks without resistance. It wasn't a full reconciliation, not yet. But it was something just as precious, the beginning of forgiveness. The sun cast soft amber streaks through the garage window that morning, the kind of light that made the dust motes in the air look like floating glitter. Jake was underneath a '93 Ford, covered in oil and half cursing at a stripped bolt when he heard the door to the office open. Hey, Claire called softly. He slid out slowly, wiping a smear of grease from his face. She stood there holding a small, neatly wrapped box, a nervous smile on her face. It's your birthday, she said. Don't pretend like you forgot. Jake blinked, sitting up. I did forget. Well, open it. He carefully peeled back the paper to find a small leather case. Inside was the watch he had nearly given up on. His mother's old pocket watch, the one he had shown her all those months ago, hopelessly broken. But now it gleamed. The ticking was soft and steady. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the lid. Inside the casing she had had one word engraved. Freedom. He stared at it, completely speechless. You said every tick is a second unlived, she whispered. So I wanted to give you back some time. Jake swallowed hard, his eyes burning. He looked up at her, his voice rough with emotion. You gave me back so much more than time. Before she could respond, he reached into the back of his main tool chest, pulling out a tiny wooden box he'd hidden there weeks ago. I was waiting for the right moment, he said, his voice a low rumble. Turns out you just made it. Claire blinked. Jake, what are you? He opened the box. Inside wasn't a diamond ring. It was a tiny, delicate brass chain with a matching watch fob, and at the end hung a tiny charm shaped like an open clock face. It's not a ring, he said, his voice full of a nervous sincerity she'd never heard before. Because what we have, it's not traditional. It's not fancy. But it's ours. He stepped closer, taking her hand in his. Will you be my timekeeper, Claire, for life? Claire gasped, tears of pure joy slipping down her cheek. She nodded, unable to speak, then let out a laugh through her tears. Yes. Yes, 1,000 times yes. Fastened the delicate chain gently around her wrist, his hands sure and steady, even though his heart was thudding like a drum against his ribs. A week later, the backyard behind the garage was transformed into something magical. Earl had strung up fairy lights between the trees. Mary brought trays of homemade scones, and Tom brought his slightly out-of-tune guitar. Sheriff Hank, still in his uniform, stood under a large oak tree, wiping his eyes with a handkerchief. Claire wore a simple dress the color of cream, her blonde hair braided with wildflowers. Jake wore his cleanest flannel shirt and a pair of boots that had been polished for the first and only time that morning. There were no violins, no crystal chandeliers, just laughter, warmth, and the quiet hum of happy engines from the garage in the background. They stood under a handmade wooden arch that Tom had covered in climbing vines. Claire took Jake's hands in hers. I never felt like I belonged anywhere, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Not in my childhood home, not in grand ballrooms, not even in our family photos. She looked around at their friends, the small, mismatched family who had stood by them, smiled with them, and worked with them. But today, I know I belong right here. With you. Jake smiled, his own eyes damp, and I never really knew what I was fixing all these years, he said, his voice full of love. Until I met you, they didn't need long formal vows. The way they looked at each other said everything that needed to be said. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in brilliant hues of gold and fire, they danced slowly beneath the trees. The music was off-key, the ground was uneven, but it was absolutely perfect. As they swayed together, Claire rested her head on Jake's shoulder. You know, she whispered, I used to think that happiness was something you had to chase, something you had to find in the light. Jake kissed the top of her head. But sometimes, she said, looking up at him, her eyes shining, it finds you when you finally stop running. 1 year later, the late afternoon sun warmed the open doors of Weller's auto. Jake, with a little less grease on his face these days, leaned over the shoulder of a shy teenager, patiently showing him how to gap a spark plug. His dream of a garage school had started small with just one kid, but it was a start. The scent of sugar and butter drifted over from the building next door, where a freshly painted sign now read, The Corner Slice Bakery. Claire emerged, wiping her hands on her apron, and brought 2 mugs of coffee over to the truck where they were working. She handed one to the boy and the other to Jake, their fingers brushing in that familiar electric way. He smiled at her, a quiet, knowing smile that still made her heart skip a beat. In that moment, among the engines and the fairy lights that they'd never bothered to take down, they had found there forever. It wasn't a story of escaping the darkness, but of 2 people learning how to build their own light together. If this story warmed your heart, reminded you that true love often blooms in the most unexpected places, and that freedom and belonging are sometimes found in a quiet garage and not a golden palace, then you're in the right place. At Soul Stirring Stories, we believe in tales that touch the soul, inspire change, and remind us of the quiet beauty in everyday lives. Subscribe now to join our growing community of story lovers. Every week, we bring you powerful, emotional, and unforgettable stories crafted to heal, uplift, and move you. Because sometimes the smallest choices lead to the biggest miracles.